Hello and welcome to Math1L, locally developed. This is the first lesson in Unit 1, and that's review of necessary skills. So we're going to be going over some of the skills that you're going to be required to master in order to be successful throughout this first unit, or throughout the whole course, in fact. So we're just going to look at today adding and subtracting integers as our topic. And at the end of this, your goal is that I can add and subtract positive and negative integers. Okay, and we're looking at it without the use of a calculator. So we're going to be dealing with smaller numbers, so it's not going to be unrealistic here. Yes, you'll have access to a calculator throughout the course, but for today I want you to work on dealing with and understanding how the adding and subtracting works. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is an integer, and simply put, an integer is any number that has no decimals or fractions. So it's any number that has no decimals or fractions. So my examples would be, it could be -5, it could be 2, it could be 10, it could be -50, and so on. So they're all numbers that have no decimals and no fractions. What's the toughest part of adding and subtracting integers? And I think, I'm assuming everyone would agree, it's dealing with negatives. Dealing with negative numbers. And a lot of people right through to grade 12 struggle with this, so this is not something that should be surprising, and it's not something that you should be concerned with, because we're going to work through it and get another chance to look and see how this does work. Last thing I want to talk about is opposites of integers. So it's very important you understand the opposites of integers. So for example, if I had a +3, the opposite would be -3. So when I talk about an opposite integer, I'm talking about the sign changing. So if I had -7, the opposite would be +7. Okay, so we're basically looking at the exact same number, the sign changes. So same number, but the sign changes. Same number, but the sign is different. Okay, so we're looking at opposite integers, so it's just the same number with the opposite sign. All right, moving along here. So a quick demonstration working with negative numbers. So I'm going to do a couple of examples here talking about adding and subtracting numbers, and I'm going to do it from a different approach and see how it works for you. So the first example I'm going to look at, and you kind of think of the answer you think it should be, and then see how close you are with the actual answer. So let's look at -3 plus -2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to represent that -3. I'm going to go with a science approach. Okay? So I'm going to look at positive and negatives. So for -3, if I put my positives over here, so I'm looking at like electrical charge, for example. So if I have 6 positives and I have 6 negatives, each positive cancels out a negative. So right now my diagram represents the number 0. I want to represent -3. So that means I have to have 3 more negatives than positives. So I'm going to take away those three positives. So now, if I match them up, I have a positive for a negative, positive for a negative, positive for a negative. So I have 3 negatives. So this particular diagram represents -3, as it is right now. Now I want to add -2. So that means that I want to add 2 more negatives. So I'm going to add 2 more negative signs to the negative side. 1, 2. And now the total number in there, if I count, those positives still cancel out with those negatives, but now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my end result here is -5. So if we look at it in terms of a number line, okay, so 0, 1, -1, -2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5. We started with negative 3, so this is where we started. And then I added 2 more negatives, and I ended up going 2 spaces to the left. So that means that negative 3, that expression up above, plus negative 2 is equivalent to or the same as negative 3 take away 2 more. All right, so negative 3. So if you have negative 3 degrees and it goes down 2 more degrees, you're going to be at negative 5. Okay, so typically this representation here kind of helps people straighten out their positives and their negatives. All right, so I'm going to do a couple more examples with that just to show you some of the other scenarios. And hopefully when you see this, it kind of helps make more sense. So let's do negative 2 minus negative 3. Okay, so actually let's just go with the same numbers. Let's go with the same order here. So negative 3 subtract negative 2. So it looks very, very similar to example 1. So again, I'm going to represent a diagram here. So with the charges, I'm going to draw my 6 positives, my 6 negatives. So because there's a positive for each negative, they would be, this represents 0 at the moment. But I don't want 0. Again, I want to represent negative 3. So how do I get negative 3? I have to have 3 more negatives than positives. So if we match them up, positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, I now have negative 3 represented here because I have 3 negatives. Now, this time I want to subtract. I want to take away 2 negatives. So I want to subtract 2 negatives here. So I'm going to take my eraser again and I'm going to subtract 2 negatives. So what is the result? The result then is I only have 1 negative sign that's not attached to anything. So my answer here is negative 1. So on a number line, what has happened here? So let's go with 1, 0, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4. So I started at negative 3 again. I subtracted negative 2, and I ended up here at negative 1. So what did I essentially do? I took negative 3, and I subtracted negative 2, but really I just took negative 3, and I added 2 to that value. So I went and added them up. So in the end, what we find happens is that we got 2 things. So extend this a little bit. So just a summary for you to take with you, and we're going to practice with that whole positive negative thing. So my summary here, if you have double signs, and double signs means 2 signs or symbols side by side. 2 double signs. First example, if you have a positive and then a negative side by side, so I'm just thinking about how I'm going to represent this. I'll just use numbers. Plus negative 2. That positive and negative, that's what I'm referring to. Here are the 2 signs side by side. We said above, when we did that example, if we have a positive and a negative side by side, I showed you that it really turns out just to be subtracting. So it ends up being negative 3 subtract 2. Second example, negative 3 subtract negative 2. If I look at those signs over here, see how we had 2 negative signs side by side? And I proved to you, using the electrical charge process or the number line, we ended up adding. So when we have 2 subtraction signs side by side, it turns out our result is to add. So negative 3 plus 2. It's much easier to complete your adding and subtracting when you only have 1 sign to deal with. Negative 3, take away 2 more, is negative 5. If you see something like this, very tricky, because now you're saying negative 3 plus negative 2, so now you're dealing with 2 signs. So our first step in our process here is to get rid of the double sign. and you need to be comfortable doing that, okay? Because these are a lot easier to deal with when there's only one sign to worry about, okay? And then when you get to this stage here, your number line makes a lot more sense when you only have one sign. So for example, if I have -2, -3, -4, -5, and this is the example I'm looking at. Now we're down to one sign, and I ask you on the number line, do -3 and take away 2 more. Most of you will say, here's -3, and if I take away 2, take away means we move left. So on the number line, if we're subtracting, we always move to the left. If we're adding, we always move to the right. So we're going to move 2 to the left. So 1, 2. Now you have an answer of -5. Similarly, setting it up the same way, so 0, -1, -2, -3, -4. Okay, -3 is our starting point again. Now it says to add 2. Add 2 means go to the right, so we go up 2 spaces, and the answer is -1. So it becomes much easier to complete the adding and subtracting integers when you have one symbol to worry about. So today, what we're concerned with, this is the first part of lesson 1. We're going to practice getting rid of these symbols, and I'm going to have you actually start back here and give me pictures of what's happening and solve that way. Then we'll move into simplification in the second part.